The Spin-off Podcast Network.
Are you making the most of your KiwiSaver investment? Generate is an award-winning KiwiSaver provider with a track record of strong long-term performance. Making a smart decision now could add tens of thousands of dollars by the time you reach retirement. Book a no-obligation chat with a Generate KiwiSaver advisor today at generatekiwisaver.co.nz/get-advice. A copy of the product disclosure statement is available at generatekiwisaver.co.nz. The issuer of the scheme is Generate Investment Management Limited, and of course, past performance does not guarantee future returns.
I'm Toby Manhire, and this is Juggernaut, the story of the Fourth Labour Government, a podcast in 6 parts.
Doesn't give my opponents much time to run up to an election, does it?
This nation is at risk.
What do you think you're up to now, you perverted little liar?
I could smell the uranium on it as you lean towards it.
There's a radical overhaul in the history of New Zealand's administration.
Juggernaut, the story of the Fourth Labour Government, made with the support of New Zealand On Air. Listen now on The Spin-off or wherever you get your podcasts.
Let's go from the start. Sorry.
On the last,
everything up. Go.
Should we do the whole thing from the start?
Yeah, go the whole thing from the start.
What the fuck? Editing exists. We don't have to tell you. We don't have. This is not as live. We don't have to take everything back to fucking.
Tēnā koutou katoa, this is Gone by Lunchtime with me, Toby Manhire, Annabelle Mather, executive producer of The Hui, Ben Thomas, and a very special guest, Ricky Martin, on Ben Thomas's chest. He's looking fine there. You were telling us before we started this podcast that you went to a Ricky Martin concert. It was slightly disappointing, but you bought the T-shirt anyway.
Yeah, my life changed in, I think it was October the 6th, 2014. It was my last day at Parliament. As soon as the new Attorney General, Chris Finlayson, was sworn in, replacing the old Attorney General, Chris Finlayson, my events-based contract at Parliament finished. I got a text from somebody up at Government House saying, it is done. I packed my bags, left, took a flight up to Auckland, and went to the Miley Cyrus concert at Victor Arena. And it was the greatest day of my life. I had wasted my life at sort of underground punk and rock venues to that point. Disgusting little scroats who couldn't play their guitars or sing. And the greatest endorphin engineers of the world combined with Miley Cyrus to just blow my brain out of my head. And I was like, now I see what I've been missing all this time. I'm dedicating myself to stadium pop superstars. So when Ricky Martin came some months later, there was no question. I bought the T-shirt in advance, knowing that I would, shoot into even more stratospheric heights of like dopamine delirium. And the show sucked. But now I got this T-shirt.
God, I love that for you.
It's
magnificent.
Great conversations, Taylor. Thanks to Yohe Butler for bearing with us. We've been prattling on for ages, and we've just learned there's another podcast coming in soon, so we're going to have to rattle through this. Thanks also to Spin-off members. We adore you, wind beneath our wings. We've got a lot to get through today.
Oh, I had a topical joke.
Oh.
Can we just
I love a topical joke. Go.
I was going to say that the T-shirt's a few years old now, so talk about a squeezed middle.
Oh, that's so good. That is so good.
Okay, thank you. You've been listening to Gone by Lunchtime. We'll be back in a fortnight. No, it's very good. We will talk about the squeeze middle, which is an interesting, strange, nebulous concept. We'll talk about the emissions reduction plan, the budget, Jacinda Ardern going to Washington, Australia, maybe trade deals, maybe a little bit of Chlöe Swarbrick if we have time, but we don't have a lot of time, so we're going to talk very quickly like this the entire course, like a racing commentary. If you, by the way, have any questions you want put to Annabelle or Ben or Ricky Martin, then send them to me on toby@thespinoff.co.nz, along with any other thoughts, feedback. Is that crazy to ask for feedback? I just thought it'd be cool. I listened to some Australian podcasts.
Does it sound a bit despo, though? Like, give us attention.
Oh.
Ask us a question.
I'm just looking to engage the audience, Bells.
Oh, okay.
I mostly want relationship questions.
Okay.
I want people to ask me about the Amber Heard Johnny Depp trial because, like, I know everything.
Really?
Yeah.
I've been focusing more on the Wagatha Christie trial. Have you been following that too?
It's perfect.
That is, beautiful British entertainment.
What is it?
It's the Colleen Rooney versus Rebecca Vardy trial, or Rebecca Vardy versus Colleen Rooney, the one where she it's Wagatha Christie because like the Wags, and she whittled down her Instagram story, people who could see it until
Incredible
the point that she exposed. It's just beautiful. And then she's been sued, and it has
so
the
Rebecca
added...
Vardy is sued for defamation, but then for the discovery for that, Rebecca Vardy now has to hand over all of her DMs and private messages. So there's discussion about Peter Andre's little chorizo, chipotle,
and the other delectable detail was the course of it. A telephone that contained most of the discoverable evidence was dropped by, I think it was by her agent, who was doing a selfie on a boat in the middle of the North Sea.
Wow.
It was very The Wire season 2, just like the phone hurled.
Anyway, it's much more wholesome than the old Amber Heard Johnny Depp trial.
It sounds amazing, but
I've
just got to. I mean, I'd love to get into the Wagatha Christie, but I've just got to carefully manage how much time I spend in court, and my primary focus has to be Johnny and Amber for now.
Do you have a take on that? Is that cancelable take? I find it. I don't want to be serious, but some of the material that is surfacing, including on my son's TikTok about that trial, is quite weird.
Well, my favourite stuff to consume when it comes to that trial is people doing cat memes and cat videos to the testimony. That's my favourite stuff. So little ginger cats dressed up in Pirates of the Caribbean outfits and stuff is where it's at for me.
Did you have time just to try and see if we might get a little bit of politics into this conversation, Annabelle, in between your obviously responsibilities to the court, to watch any of the Australian election? Did you?
No. Unfortunately, I didn't. I didn't get to see any of the Australian election, but I read about it afterwards.
Okay.
Yeah.
And do you have any opinions on the results in the Australian election? Any thoughts, any observations, any sizzling hot takes?
Well, I think kind of what it says is that, like, for Australians, climate change is a lot less of an abstract idea as it is for New Zealanders. You know, like literally when your country catches on fire for months on end and then rains for a long time, it's sort of harder to be in denial about it. But I do kind of think that there was echoes of the election result they've just had in our last election result, and that is like Chlöe winning Auckland Central, because I think that people in urban centres probably care a bit more or feel more motivated about climate change than people who live rurally do, because they've got skin in the game in terms of agriculture and all of that kind of stuff, whereas people who live in the city can afford to care more about the, being on fire and whatnot. So I don't think it's completely out of the blue. It's a little bit similar to what's happened here. I think there's important lessons for Jacinda Ardern and her advisors come the next election. Primarily, don't be lured onto a netball court or a rugby field to play sports against children. I think that's a big one. What else did I think about it? In terms of the 501s, I don't think that this is going to have a huge impact on what's happening here with the 501s being deported. I do think there may be a bit of a slight softening, maybe more use of that ministerial discretion part of their legislation. But if we think it's going to stop the flow, it's not.
It's not going to turn around, but it might have been that Scott Morrison would have accelerated it. He'd been hinting at that. So I mean, that's a pretty small gain.
But the tap won't be turned off because, by and large, Australians are xenophobes and they love kicking people out of the country.
And the difference between the two parties on that, it's the same as on the the refugee, the boat people thing as they call it. That the difference between the two parties has been eliminated. And Ben, there was a lot of talk in the Australian election campaign about this small target strategy, that was being run by Albanese and Labor after what happened last time around with Shorten, when it was seen that basically you had Scott Morrison himself, then a little bit more of a newbie for the Australian public who hadn't yet got to know him and dislike him, but it became an election about the opposition. It became an election, which we remember a bit in terms of some of the Labor years here, in terms of the way that John Key made it about David Cunliffe
show me the money,
show me the money stuff, all that sort of stuff, and the small target strategy, which is not a new thing and has been talked about in New Zealand politics before, but the Australians love to talk about it, was the idea that there was much less to aim at, to put it simply, right?
Yeah, and both parties do this. John Key ran a small target strategy in 2008. You tend to do it when the tide is turning against the government. People say oppositions don't win elections, governments lose them, and the small target strategy is sort of the logical extension of that. You basically, and look, National's certainly doing that now. They're concentrating, laser-like on cost of living and government spending, just those two things. They don't want to get into the details on particularly much at all. And look, Labor does the same sort of thing. When Jacinda Ardern ruled out capital gains tax forever, finally, she put to bed a big bogeyman that had been used against Labor in elections, for the last decade.
Similarly, going back to superannuation now with both parties, right?
Yeah, that's right. And you've seen it, climate change is another good example in the sense that in New Zealand, you actually don't have, as you pointed out in your spin-off piece about the Australian elections, you don't have that big gap between the two parties or the two factions on climate change. National says we agree with the targets. We agree with climate action. We agree with reducing our carbon emissions. That wasn't the case in Australia, where it became a marked difference, in the opposition's favour.
Well, within what's called the coalition, the Nationals, you had basically people trying to be linked to their national tickets, just going around saying, yeah, fuck that, we're not going to do they can say what they like. Pretty much.
They said it's dead in the water. Now, particularly with urban voters, that won't wash anymore. But in New Zealand, part of that small target thing is saying, yeah, look, sure, we agree with that. It's fine. You reduce the differences and you make one big difference, which is cost of living. And the interesting thing about cost of living is you don't even really have to promise much. You just point out that things aren't great now, and people sort of fill it in. The same way that your brain fills in the detail in a picture, even though you're only focusing on what's right in the center.
And this is when that old adage about being the leader of the opposition is the hardest job in Parliament is actually completely incorrect, because you can just sit there and throw stones and not really have to back it up with any policy or anything.
Absolutely. When I started, I went to work in the Beehive at the beginning of the Key government. And, various colleagues that I'd talked to had been there in opposition, and they said, opposition must be a bit stink because, you don't get to do anything, you're not involved in actual change. And they said, but last year and a half was pretty good because you just attack the government, then you're done by 4 p.m. and you sit back and watch the news and watch the government fall in popularity, and it's great.
And it's one of the reasons that, isn't it, the pollsters like to look at the right track, wrong track a lot these days, because from an opposition point of view, if it's tracking the right way for you, then, as you say, get the hell out of there, and make it a referendum on the way we're going. And if the way we're going includes cost of living, includes ram raids, includes, that may or may not be able to be pinned to the government or policy, but it suits you.
Yeah. And look, as the Labor Party showed, small target often works better for getting elected. We saw this with Labor as well. Back in 2017, they started. Jacinda Ardern started making a lot of captain's calls, ruling out the sort of super ambitious plans. Apart from obvious sort of moonshot vote getters like Kiwi Build, but things which would have negative effects that you could point to. And so look, it's smart politics. It isn't great for democracy.
Doesn't make for big ideas-based campaigns. One of the things, Annabelle, you mentioned was that in some ways the things we saw in the Australian election had their foreshadows in New Zealand. And one of the obvious differences is we have an electoral system that is designed to allow voices beyond the two main parties. That is its raison d'etre, right? After what happened in the 70s and early 80s, and this election was interesting in Australia because both main parties lost vote, It's just that Labour didn't lose as much as the coalition did. They went down by, I think, almost 1% in terms of their vote. And you saw the rise of these independents, including the Teal independents that you mentioned, which are grabbing seats off in these, leafy, wealthy, liberal strongholds, places as well, and where the Liberal Party in Australia does lots of fundraising, has lots of functions. It's really important stuff. But maybe that's less of a problem here because we have those third parties already around. Do you think that there will be anything in playing out in terms of our election, in terms of the strain on the National Party with a Teal thing, or I guess even with the other things we talk about is the role of women, the fact that basically women got, some terrific writing on this in the Australian press about women getting basically done over in this election and responding both in terms of the candidates, in terms of the policies, and in terms of the vote.
It is extraordinary that in the year 2022 you would have a major governing party of, a Western democracy losing because they they didn't have enough representation of women and they dismissed women's concerns, even more on a rhetorical level. It's not that there was anything. Australia is not like the United States where you're seeing the repeal of Roe and sort of genuine attacks on women's rights. A lot of it was a sort of tonal thing where the LNP and the Liberals in particular have, the National Party is these sort of buffoons, but the Liberal Party has been openly provocative and antagonistic, going way back to when Tony Abbott became Prime Minister. And, he had one woman in his cabinet of 20 and no Minister of Women's Affairs. And when there was a small mini outcry about that, he sort of stood at the podium and said, well, I've appointed a Minister of Women's Affairs and it's me. How do you like that, ladies? Any issues you'd like to raise with your minister? Honestly, just like a middle finger the size of Uluru. If it shows anything, it shows that the dalliance that I think the Liberals had with these sort of culture wars, went really badly for them. And you can see that if Luxon has been very vocal saying that, he needs more diversity in that national caucus. The list will be a real moment of truth for them and some of the candidate selections and seats that they're likely.
Well, we saw Tauranga, didn't we, where there was that kind of unforgettable picture of those candidate selections are made within the electorates themselves, and it's the list which is the main bit where that's corrected.
Just in terms of the climate change aspect, I don't think that there's going to be an impact at our next election, but potentially the one after. And I think that what it shows is that there's room to move within the green space. And I think that, if the Greens aren't smart, we may see some new types of green movements, whether it's teal green or a more purpley green, I don't know, that starts to fill that space. I'm sure that there will be people who are disappointed with James Shaw's emission reduction scheme, and so we could see the rise of a more left wing green, a more not extreme, but a green movement that wants greater change faster, and a teal movement, and there could be room for them, and with MMP that could happen.
It's true, isn't it, that even though, notwithstanding the things we've said about how there is already much less distance between the main parties on climate than there is. What is, I think, undeniably true is that here, there, around the world, climate may not be the number one decisive factor in people's votes, but it is increasing. It is increasing, and it will continue to increase, and it will continue to be more of a factor in elections. And so, for example, for a party like TOP, will have to make a decision about how much they foreground that when they determine whatever their 2, 3, 4, big policies are. Can
I just make a prediction that TOP will say a UBI will solve climate change? And here are 25 pages of graphs to show you why. to a press conference sort of held in a small phone booth.
We're not doing very well so far in terms of motoring through things, and that's my fault. Albanese was sworn in, and then within a matter of minutes, he was sort of zoomed off to Japan to take part in the Quad, and there seems to have been a whole bunch of, in the Asia Pacific region, a whole bunch of geopolitical stuff happening in the last few days, which I know excites everybody. There was also the announcement Ardern has set off to Washington, which I think she's arriving with like 2 massive suitcases full of milk powder to solve the shortage there, direct from New World Victoria Park. And before she left, at the airport, she took part in a meeting to announce the next stage of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. I think that's right, which is kind of the not the CPTPP or the CP3PO, as the nerds in Wellington have taken to calling it.
I'm just writing down the names of all of these organs. I'm like,
and Ardern is in New York now.
She's in New York.
She's going to meet the president, Stephen Colbert. She's been at the UN.
She emerged from her motorcade and told reporters that she didn't even notice the motorcade, which I think is something. There's something about Labour Prime Ministers. Helen Clark didn't notice when she was going 170 k's along the plains of the Waitaki.
I once did an interview with Clark Gayford.
Strange balance.
There's a very good bit in an interview I did with Clark Gayford, and he was very entertaining on motorcades, on going on a trip around Europe with Ardern. I think maybe the first one after she was made Prime Minister, and just noting how all the motorcades offered kind of clues to the cultural nature of like the way the Germans were very something and the Brits were very something. It's quite entertaining.
The Americans are lots of machine guns.
They love it. just kicking over pedestrians just to prove they can. Yeah.
Are you curious about how business can be better? I'm Simon Pound, and I host Business is Boring, a podcast where I caught it all with some of the most interesting people in entrepreneurship, commerce, and making things happen. Tune in to Business is Boring every Tuesday, brought to you by the Spin-Off Podcast Network in partnership with Spark Business Lab.
Kia ora, I'm Duncan Grieve, founder of The Spin-Off. You can help us keep all of The Spin-Off's award-winning journalism free for everybody by becoming a member today at thespinoff.co.nz/donate.
Kia ora, I'm Alex Casey, senior writer at The Spin-Off. We wouldn't exist without the ongoing support of our generous members. If you're able to, you can make a donation at thespinoff.co.nz/donate.
So let's go straight to Ardern in America, Annabelle. There's been talk about whether or not the White House meeting will happen. She's gone there with a trade delegation. There's going to be a sort of a general push to try and get a whole lot of people to sign up to travel to New Zealand. She's got a clipboard. She's going to get people to sign their names, leave their emails.
They've got 6 spare places on the Hercules.
on the plane back. But how important is that White House meeting? The way it's being briefed is that because of she has had COVID recently. In fact, she couldn't catch the 757 that left for the delegation because she had to hold off for the period of time you had to have been since you tested negative, etc. And the White House obviously has quite strict COVID protocols, and so they're trying to work their way around that. It sounds, you would have thought they wouldn't be saying that unless there was a reasonable confidence that the meeting would happen. If they can do that. How much of a big deal is it?
Well, it sounded like the meeting was going to be a given before she got COVID, didn't it? But then it's sort of been complicated by COVID. I actually think, given what's going on in the States at the moment, that Biden would probably be quite keen to meet with her, to be seen with this very progressive young wahine leader, especially given, Roe v. Wade and all of that sort of stuff. Like, she is very popular in the US. And so I imagine that, it wouldn't be a massive chore for them to meet with her. They'd probably quite like it.
Put an all-black top on him and a squeaky kiwi and the whole thing.
Yeah, so I think with the exception of, what's his name, Carlson Tucker or whatever.
Catch up on how Burton Shipley's doing.
Yeah. Council.
Yeah, that
Is she going on that show?
NZ hellhole will be.
Yeah, he calls her
trending in no time.
He calls her that squeaky woman with the teeth, I think was his tender epithet for the New Zealand Prime Minister. Ben, how much of a big deal is it? I mean, and it's a big deal because it's being played out in the talkback conversations. You know, it's sort of a nice thing to boil it down. And John Key said she needs the White House meet. You know, it's sort of. Does it really matter?
If you don't get the White House meeting, you don't get the golf game.
Well,
this is crucial.
Well,
this is the crucial
first
step.
Where's the fucking tweet? That's what I want to know. Where's the Barack Obama tweet? That's what she needs to come back with.
You know who the CE of Air New Zealand was at the time?
Remind me.
Who brought over Obama?
Can't think of any famous former.
It was Christopher Luxon.
Oh.
No way.
Wow. And he hasn't been held accountable for the tweet yet. Look, I mean, obviously, any New Zealand leader meeting the leader of the United States is a big deal. You know, it is important for us to be on the world stage, involved in these discussions. There are big things happening with the United States and with Australia. You know, AUKUS, that we are not really involved in, and there are arguments about, where we should be positioned there. There's no clear-cut answers, but we at least need to be on the periphery of those discussions. We need to be a live sort of actor from the point of view of pure politics. It is good for, the Prime Minister to be seen on the world stage, whether appearing on the cover of Vogue is sort of, or being in Vogue is, particularly important, who knows. But sure, shaking hands with the president, obviously, it sort of puts you on a kind of plane of leadership, above your competitors. So, from that point of view, an important thing for Ardern to do. And look, geopolitics is not as settled as once it was. China is sort of showing the sort of expansionism, in a more heavy-handed way in the Pacific than, probably the sort of level of kind of involvement that, everyone's been anticipating. But has been, we sort of walk around it. Obviously events in Europe are providing a challenge to the geopolitical world order, the rules-based system, and at its heart, that's New Zealand's key interest, is a rules-based system for trade.
And that's what this Indo-Pacific Economic Framework is a great big fudge, because they want to assert the rules-based framework. They want to assert America's role in the region against a rising China, but they don't want to allow access to their markets because then they will lose the election. That's the calculation. And so they're trying to juggle all those things. And then we also had, of course, you mentioned what's happening in Europe.
I didn't even bring up the prospect of a free trade agreement with the US because it will literally never happen.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is this is the struggle they have, that basically the TPP, now the CPTPP, which, was jettisoned by Donald Trump in almost his first act, it seems, as you say, dead in the water, which is very frustrating, I think, for a lot of the people who spent so long on it. Whether or not it's a good idea is another matter. And then meanwhile, there's Canada, who are proving quite frustrating in terms of their, we're taking them to whatever the tribunal is. It's not the WTO, is it? Let's leave that right there. Meanwhile, as well, Taiwan, you talk about Europe and Ukraine. We had Joe Biden, who was in Japan for this Quad meeting, and who said yes when asked whether or not they would take up arms in defense of Taiwan, which sent the State Department into an absolute frenzy of trying to say, no, it's no change to our existing, what's it called, strategic ambiguity. Yeah. Status. And so, and all of that, it's a big swirl of stuff, right? Including a little kind of footnote, which is New Zealand not signing a letter from the missions in Taiwan calling again for Taiwan to have observer status at the World Health Assembly, which is underway now in Geneva. All this stuff, there are all these different little parts, and it's New Zealand is not a big part in that, but in terms of trying to balance that relationship between Washington and Beijing, that would suggest that for Joe Biden, a meeting is a good idea, and that the chances are it will probably happen if they can make it so, right?
Yeah.
Okay, let's
plus more motorcades.
Let's shift back. Seems like a long time ago, but it wasn't. It was just over a week ago. We had the budget. Not even a week ago. 6 days.
6 days ago.
How's your squeezed middle now, Ben? We were talking about squeezed middle before, trying to work out what it was. Did we work out what it was, Bells? Did you solve what is?
No,
can you define the squeezed middle?
I don't know what it is. I'm so confused. I don't know who's in and who's out and where it kicks in. Do you have to have kids or I don't know?
Do you get a card, like a squeezed middle card?
Yeah.
I mean, that's because if you got a gold, it's not a gold card.
Are mum and dad investors squeezed? I don't like.
Yeah,
they're
squeezed. They're squeezed.
I've got to be honest. I've just been like, it's been keeping me up all night, like just worrying about the intergenerational unfairness for like Max Key and
squeezing is Max Key part of the squeezed middle. It is.
The only squeezed middle Max Key has is when he does a 2-minute plank.
Yeah, he can really squeeze his middle.
We're talking about the squeeze middle because there was much talk with the cost of living crisis, inflation, yada, 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 how this budget was about serving the interests or trying to mollify the squeeze middle, which is people who are finding their spending power reduced. And while it seems quite an ambiguous term, Ed Miliband was the first. I don't know if he was the first user. He certainly popularised it. Maybe 12 years ago or so in the UK, where it was about UK Labour trying to address the fact that there were people everybody was struggling in houses across what we could call Middle England, for want of a better term. And that was Ben whence this $350 cash payment and a bunch of instalments is trying to address. People who have seen the cost of living wipe out what might have some years ago been a bit more comfortable existence and struggling to meet their bills, mortgages, rents, as the price of tasty cheese goes through the roof, had to downgrade to Colby. On a scale, I mean, you can look at it different ways, right? Like an attempt to directly address the cost of living crisis for people who aren't receiving benefits or aren't wealthy enough. You could look at it as a direct bribe to a group of voters.
And the latter is its genesis, right? Labour will, we know that it was devised in a shorter time frame than much of what else was in the budget. It's a Grant Robertson special. It's, which group of voters haven't we done anything for recently? Who are we in danger of losing to national? It's people in this income bracket. Let's give them $350. Let's give them, the same as the winter energy payment for a single person, is it? I think it is.
Yeah.
Yeah. Treasury obviously said that that's probably not the best way to do it. Patrick Smelly actually wrote a good piece in Business Desk about Treasury maybe having to reassert its role as a bit of a gatekeeper of public finances, which it's fallen down a bit on in the last sort of decade or two. Politically, it's actually really interesting because I looked at the timeline. So the first payment comes on 1 August. The government's extended fuel subsidy cuts out 15 August. That was also a budget announcement. And then you get two more
2 months.
Yeah, and then you get 2 more of your cost of living allowance payments. So in a way, Robertson is trying to sort of smooth out that kind of removal of the subsidies so that people won't sort of feel immediately more hard done by.
Squeezed it.
Because if you, as you can see, by driving around, fuel back up to about $3. It's back up to about the same price that it was when when it was seen as politically untenable, and a 25-cent discount was slapped on the excise charge. So, there will be a shock and a political shock, unless something, magical happens in the oil market around that mid-August point, at which point people's fuel bills will go up again. You will have just received, 2 weeks ago, you will have received your first $110 payment, and that can go on your gas card, and then you've got 2 more payments to come. So in a way, the government does have this sort of, because the government is taking these steps to sort of cushion the cost of living increases, you are left with this sort of, there is an endpoint somewhere, and that endpoint is going to be politically difficult, and it becomes harder and harder to sort of pull out of it. So, after 1 October, which is the last payment, at that point, then the government has its own, another political challenge in terms of cost of living, and they will hope that inflation is sort of smoothed over, the war in Ukraine is finished, Russia has been conquered by the United States, which has increased its oil production for the territories. These are the sort of vexed problems you get when you sort of try to manipulate, each family or each individual's experience of cost of living problems.
Look, I'm not an economist, but I am an astrologist.
Yes.
And from an Aries rising perspective, I was underwhelmed by the budget. I don't know when the last time Grant Robertson went shopping was, but $350 is literally like not even an overflowing size trolley of groceries. So I think what it does is it kind of fiddles around the edges, but it doesn't really go to the heart of what is squeezing the middle. And again, I think it comes back to Labor not being courageous enough when it comes to issues like capital gains tax, like a financial transaction tax, like removing GST on groceries. I mean, people are saying it's like classic Grant Robertson. I would love to have seen a policy like when he removed interest from student loans. Like that was a genuinely transformational policy. So, as much aroha as I have for the squeezed middle, I'm also worried about the crushed poor.
Yep.
And I think Labor could have done something truly transformational, like forgiving all debt owed to WINS by beneficiaries. Because when we stick people in emergency housing, they're actually being charged for that. They have to pay that back. When they go get a food grant, they have to pay that back. And we know that the system is encrusted with racism because when you look at the rates that debt is paid back at, Māori beneficiaries, particularly Māori women, are charged at a higher rate than Pākehā. Whose article was that? Someone recently did an investigation into it. So those, I think, would have been really transformational change. And from an Indigenous perspective, if we're not going to tax the rich, can we at least eat them? That's all I want to know.
Certainly something to consider. Maybe chuck it into Golriz Garaman's bill. There's a bunch of different electoral reform options there. Might get onto that.
It does show the sort of conceptual incoherence, when you start getting into, subsidies here, subsidies there, giveaways here and there. So during COVID, during the lockdowns, the government doubled the winter energy payment for superannuitants and beneficiaries to reflect the travails of COVID. Now, their costs didn't increase over COVID and their income didn't go down because they're on fixed incomes. So actually, people on fixed incomes were the least affected by the COVID lockdowns. It was actually people who, were in jobs, who couldn't go to work, who were worse off during lockdowns. Now, of course, inflation actually bites people on fixed incomes more, harder than people who are in work and can ask for pay rises, and the government says, well, actually, the money's got to go not to people on fixed incomes, it's going to the squeezed middle or whatever. And so there's a real philosophical sort of lack of consistency here and a practical lack of consistency here. And that's the sort of clue that this is really just kind of political.
It's a stopgap budget, isn't it, really? Like, I mean, the National was trying to portray it as they said a backwards budget and what was the other one?
Did they say blinkered budget?
There was another B word. Budget, yeah, the blowout budget. I think they were going for budget, as well. Yeah. Which I'm not sure if that necessarily tracks true because one of the critical things, of course, about this $350 payment is that it is a one-off, and that placates Treasury to some extent. But
I think Luxon's right in one sense when he talks about wasteful spending, because, I mean, if you look at the winter energy payment, everyone over the age of 65 who gets superannuation gets it, but not everyone needs it. Like, Bob Jones doesn't need it. Winston Peters probably doesn't need it. So, like, if you had more targeted spending so that some people are getting more than 350 and the ones who don't need it are getting less, that would be a more responsible approach to spending that money.
And that loops us back to our conversation about small target strategies, doesn't it? Like, neither party is gonna go there.
No, that's right. You certainly don't want old people upset. They all vote.
Yeah.
That's the terrible thing. I mean, that's the issue, right? We don't need to lower the voting age as per Chlöe Swarbrick's bill. We need to set a maximum, probably at 65. As soon as
I was thinking this last night. Okay. It's like, if we're not going to let 16-year-olds vote, we should probably not let people over the age of 65 vote.
This also
you can't have it both ways.
This also addresses
the rich and reduce the franchise to all people under the age of 65 are the two conclusions from our independent panel on electoral reform today.
Yeah, now just following up something that we discussed in the pre-budget Gone by Lunchtime special.
Oh, yes.
Where I talked about how our arts infrastructure funding was the least popular announcement of the 2009 budget by English. I think by the national government. That was about $10 million or something. This year, massive, $7.5 million for the Royal New Zealand Ballet.
Sure. Yeah.
And guess how much Te Matatini got?
About $2 million, I think.
Yeah, even though literally tens of thousands of people participate in Matatini and hundreds of thousands of spectators come, it gets way less than New Zealand Symphony Orchestra and Royal New Zealand Ballet that has way less reach and way less participation. So it's a good example of inequity again in the system. And the Māori Party did a press release last week having a twak because, of course, Rawiri Waititi is a kapa haka aficionado winner.
There are also some questions about the amounts of money that were going relatively to Health NZ and the Māori Health Authority. And I think we should talk about that at greater length soon in terms of those health reforms. We could just touch really briefly on that electoral reform program. Gowras Garaman's bill was drawn from the ballot, and it's sort of a collection, it's kind of a medley of electoral reform.
A grab bag.
A smorgasbord. And then within maybe 48 hours, Chris Farfoy announced an independent panel to consider electoral reform, which seems like will be probably, I don't know, can they coexist? It seems like a bit of bad luck, really, for Gowras Garaman, insofar as that will give them a pretext to say, oh no, we're not going to let that one through on the first reading because we've got our own program underway.
Some of the stuff is absolute no-brainers, like Māori being able to switch roles. It's ridiculous. Yeah. Why do they even need to have another whatchamacallit on it? Like, just pass the legislation already. It's stupid.
Yeah. I mean, I think this does, lets Labour off the hook because I think there are a number of there's a number of very sensible reforms in Garaman's bill, but then it's coupled in with this, letting 16-year-olds vote, which I saw a Curia poll which said that about 5% of the electorate's in favour of that.
But you want to change that so that nobody over the age of 65 gets to vote on whether people over the age of 60. I mean, it's going to be a very complicated system.
But yeah, I mean, 16-year-old voting, I think would be a huge distraction for the government in the sense that not only is it something that I think is broadly unpopular, but you would just have so many of these fucking precocious teens on the airwaves and just sort of rehearsing their canned lines. It'd just be insufferable.
I don't know. Look, we've got to finish this.
Look, if you've never been bullied by a 16-year-old precocious
I would much rather
spokesperson on RNZ's The Panel, then I don't want to hear your
I trust the 16-year-old's judgment over the boomers' judgment any day.
Bless you, boomers. We love you dearly. Don't listen to these awful, unkind teenagers that I'm gathered with. We're going to talk about the Chlöe movie. We don't really have time. Quick word on the NZ On Air funding the Chlöe documentary, which became a sort of brief focus of controversy. Should we be just making films about all the candidates? I saw someone going, they're not going to make a movie about a TV documentary about Simeon Brown. And I thought, personally, I'd love to watch a documentary about Simeon Brown, quite seriously.
No, look, it's about, there's nothing wrong with doing documentaries about politicians. Chlöe Swarbrick is an interesting person, an interesting story. At the same time, I watched the short film that the producers who've got this funding to make a feature out of did about Chlöe. And it's not exactly a hard-hitting fly-on-the-wall kind of thing. It's kind of like an ad. If we could get the high watermark, I think, in New Zealand terms is that that movie Campaign from the 1996 election. Yep. And actually the director of that was spotted with Jamie Lee Ross during the campaign last year. He was actually, I got alerted to this because he turned up with Jamie Lee Ross to The Nation.
Is that right?
Before JamieLee Ross took one look at who was in the green room and turned around and left. and so that a fly on the wall documentary, of that campain, I'd love to see.
That would be interesting, wouldn't it? And we may have more to say about that in another podcast. Finally, Annabelle.
I just think that David Seymour, I completely disagree, and I think that all the politicians jumping in on this actually politicises New Zealand On Air even more. And what's the difference between a documentary and being on Q&A or something like that? But also, I feel like David Seymour really doesn't have any moral high ground in this space. If you believe in it, get someone else to lead the argument. But this is a guy who received his taxpayer-funded salary while doing Dancing with the Stars. So it's like, bro, this is not for you. This argument is not for you.
My only observation in terms of the politics of it is that when I was working for the Minister for the Arts, Creative New Zealand gave $20,000 to Nikki Hager to go to the Venice Biennale. So as far as I can tell, the creative funding agencies are veering positively.
It's about the 7th or 8th time you brought that up on this podcast, and you're going to start talking about Jeffrey Palm. Before we do that, let's call it quits. Ka kite.
Say bye.
Talofa lover, I'm Madeline Chapman, editor at The Spinoff. If you have the means, consider supporting our high-quality journalism by becoming a Spinoff member. Sign up now at thespinoff.co.nz/donate.
Do you find it hard staying optimistic with all the financial news in the media? I'm Bernard Hickey, and on my podcast, When the Facts Change, I'm here to help you navigate the ever-changing landscape of economics in Aotearoa. So join the conversation every Friday on When the Facts Change, brought to you by the Spinoff Podcast Network in partnership with KiwiBet.
The Spinoff Podcast Network.